The ruined battlefield. The battlefield was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that followed destruction, heavy and unnatural. Smoke still rose from twisted metal and scorched ground. The air smelled of burnt machinery and something worse, death. Daniel Reed walked carefully through the wreckage. His boots crunched over shattered debris, but he kept his steps light, his ears sharp. He wasn't supposed to be here. This planet, Arion 4, was under strict military control after a massive battle between humans and an alien species known as the Chrythans. Daniel wasn't a soldier. He was a scavenger. He came to places like this after the fighting stopped, picking through the remains for anything valuable. A broken weapon, a piece of technology, anything he could sell to survive. He adjusted the strap of his pack, already weighed down with a few salvaged items, and scanned the area. His eyes lingered on the remains of a Chrythan warship, its sleek black hull ripped open like a tin can. Smoke curled from its engines, and the bodies of its crew were scattered around. Daniel tried not to look too closely at them. It didn't matter which side they had fought for. Dead was dead. As he moved closer to the ship, a faint noise stopped him in his tracks. He froze, every muscle in his body tense. The sound came again, a soft, high-pitched whimper. It wasn't human, but it wasn't mechanical either. It was alive. Daniel's heart raced. He scanned the wreckage, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. His instincts told him to leave. The battlefield was still dangerous, and the whimpering could be a trap. Chrythan patrols sometimes left behind wounded soldiers as bait, hoping to lure in rescuers or scavengers like him. But something about the sound tugged at him. It wasn't the cry of a soldier. It was too weak, too desperate. Against his better judgment, Daniel followed the noise. He moved cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He rounded a corner of the broken ship and stopped when he saw it. It was a child, a Chrythan child. She was small, barely reaching his knee, with pale blue skin and large, dark eyes that shimmered like pools of oil. Her clothes were torn, and her body was covered in scratches and burns, a dark, sticky liquid. Her blood leaked from a wound on her side. She looked up at him, trembling, her small hands clutching her stomach. She didn't speak, but her eyes begged for help. Daniel stared at her, unsure of what to do. Chrythans were the enemy. They had attacked human colonies without warning, slaughtering millions. He had seen the aftermath of their raids, the devastation they left behind. But this child didn't look like an enemy. She looked scared and broken, left to die in the ruins of a battle she probably didn't understand. He took a step closer, and she flinched, letting out a small, frightened noise. He stopped, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Hey," he said softly, his voice shaking a little. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The child didn't move, but she didn't cry out again either. Daniel crouched down, keeping his movements slow. Up close, he could see how bad her injuries were. She wouldn't survive much longer without help. He didn't know anything about Chrythan biology, but he knew blood loss when he saw it. His mind raced. Helping her would be risky. If Chrythan soldiers found him with one of their young, they'd kill him on the spot. And even if they didn't, carrying her through the battlefield would make him a target for drones and scavengers alike. It would be smarter to walk away, to pretend he hadn't seen her. But he couldn't. Something deep inside him wouldn't let him. She was just a kid. Daniel sighed and pulled a medkit from his pack. The child watched him, her eyes wide, but she didn't resist when he gently pressed a bandage to her wound. She winced, a soft whimper escaping her lips, but she stayed still. "Hang in there, kid," he muttered. "We'll get you out of here." He wasn't sure how he was going to do that yet. The nearest human outpost was miles away, and the battlefield was crawling with patrols. But he'd figure it out. He always did. As he finished wrapping her wound, a distant sound made his stomach drop. The low hum of engines, growing louder. A patrol was coming. Daniel scooped the child into his arms, her small body light, but awkward to carry. She tensed at first, then relaxed against him, too weak to resist. He adjusted his grip and started moving, his eyes scanning the ruins for a safe place to hide. The engines grew louder, the sound vibrating through the air. Daniel ducked into the shadow of a broken wall, pressing his back against the cold metal. The child clung to him, her breathing shallow but steady. The patrol passed overhead, a sleek black drone hovering just above the wreckage. Its sensors swept the area, a red beam of light scanning for signs of life. Daniel held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The beam passed inches from his face, but the drone moved on, disappearing into the smoke. Daniel let out a shaky breath and looked down at the child. Her eyes were half closed, her body limp. She was fading fast. "Stay with me," he whispered. "We're not done yet." He shifted her weight and started moving again, heading toward the edge of the battlefield. He didn't know if they'd make it, but he wasn't going to leave her behind. Not like this. For now, that was enough. Escape through the shadows. The bunker door groaned as Daniel pulled it open, revealing a narrow passage that plunged into darkness. He didn't have time to hesitate. The faint hum of approaching patrol drones was getting louder, and every second spent above ground was a risk. "Hold on, kid," Daniel muttered to the unconscious alien child in his arms. Her small body was cold against his chest, and the hastily applied bandage was already seeping with her dark blue blood. He adjusted his grip and stepped into the blackness, letting the door swing shut behind him. The passage smelled of damp metal and decay, the remnants of some old war base abandoned long before the Krithan invasion. Daniel had found it during a previous scavenging run and turned it into a makeshift hideout, never imagining he'd one day use it to shield an enemy child. His boots echoed softly as he descended the narrow stairway, his flashlight cutting a weak beam through the gloom. The bunker's silence was oppressive, but Daniel welcomed it. At least down here, the patrol drones couldn't find them. When he reached the bottom, he laid the child carefully on a weathered cot. The dim light from a flickering wall panel cast her features in sharp relief. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale against her blue skin. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that might crack at the slightest touch. Daniel knelt beside her, opening his medkit again. "All right, let's see what we can do," he murmured. He wasn't a medic, and alien physiology was a mystery to him, but he patched up enough wounds in his scavenging days to know the basics. He cleaned the wound as best he could and applied a sealant patch, hoping it wouldn't react poorly with her skin. The child stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked confused, disoriented, and then her gaze locked onto his. Fear flashed in her dark, liquid eyes, but she didn't scream. Instead, she whispered something, a soft, melodic sound in her alien tongue. Daniel shook his head. "I don't understand you, kid," he said. "But I'll keep you safe, okay?" She didn't reply, but her gaze softened, and she seemed to relax slightly. Daniel sighed, slumping back against the wall. His nerves were frayed, and his body ached from carrying her through the ruins. But there was no time to rest. He needed a plan. As he considered their next move, a faint beep echoed from his wrist. His old comm device was picking up a signal, encrypted but unmistakable. Krithan patrols. They were sweeping the area, likely searching for survivors or equipment. If they found the bunker, it was over. Daniel turned off the comm device, silencing the noise. He glanced at the child, who was watching him now, her eyes half-lidded but alert. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he asked quietly. She didn't respond, but the tension in her small body told him enough. She wasn't just any Krithan child. There was something important about her. Something that made her a target. Great. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. Saving her was already a gamble, but now it seemed he'd stepped into something much bigger than a simple scavenger's run. He didn't regret it, yet, but he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. The bunker shuddered faintly, a sign that the patrol drones were nearby. Daniel grabbed his sidearm and checked its charge. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He glanced back at the child. "Stay quiet," he said. "No matter what you hear, don't make a sound." She didn't seem to understand his words, but the fear in her eyes suggested she understood the tone. Daniel stood, moving toward the entrance. He positioned himself in the shadows, his back pressed against the cold metal wall, and waited. The faint hum grew louder, accompanied by the sharp click of mechanical legs. The patrol had sent ground drones this time, small, spider-like machines designed for tight spaces. Daniel had seen what they could do to a person and had no intention of finding out firsthand. One of the drones crawled into view, its sleek black body reflecting the dim light. Its sensor array swiveled, scanning the room. Daniel held his breath, his hand gripping the sidearm tightly. He knew he couldn't fight them all, not in these tight quarters. His best chance was to stay hidden and hope they didn't detect the child's faint heat signature. The drone moved closer, its sensors lingering on the cot. Daniel tensed, ready to act if it found her. But before it could make a move, a loud crash echoed from somewhere above. The drone froze, its sensors flicking toward the noise, and then it scuttled away, retreating back up the stairs. Daniel exhaled shakily, his heart pounding. Something, or someone, had caused the distraction. He didn't know if it was luck or another threat, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. He returned to the child, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Change of plans," he said, scooping her up again. "We're leaving." The bunker had been a temporary refuge, but it was no longer safe. Whatever had caused the crash above could just as easily turn on them. Daniel adjusted his grip on the child and moved toward the hidden exit, his mind racing. The shadows of the battlefield awaited them once more, and this time, Daniel knew they wouldn't escape unscathed. But he wasn't about to abandon her. Not now. Not ever. As the bunker door creaked open, the cold air hit his face, carrying with it the faint scent of danger. He stepped into the ruins, his resolve hardening. The fight for survival had only just begun. The hidden refuge. Daniel's arms burned as he trudged through the dense forest on the outskirts of the battlefield. The war-torn terrain had given way to a strange, haunting quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint hum of distant patrol drones. His makeshift shelter wasn't far now, but his grip on the alien child, Kara, was faltering. Her small, fragile body felt heavier with every step. "You're tougher than you look, kid," Daniel muttered under his breath. Kara didn't respond. Her head rested limply against his chest, her pale blue skin cold to the touch. The patch he'd applied to her wounds seemed to be holding, but she needed real medical attention, something he couldn't provide out here. A glimmer of moonlight caught on a jagged metal sign half buried in the dirt ahead. It marked the entrance to an old underground complex, abandoned long before the Krithan War. The shelter had been a lucky find during one of Daniel's earlier scavenging trips, a relic of another forgotten conflict. Now, it was their best shot at staying alive. Daniel shifted Kara in his arms and knelt beside the entrance, brushing away debris to reveal a keypad. The device was ancient, its screen flickering faintly. He punched in a sequence of numbers and waited, holding his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan, the hidden door slid open, revealing the dark, narrow passage. "Home sweet home," he muttered, stepping inside. The air inside was stale and damp, but it was better than the open battlefield. Daniel descended a metal staircase, his boots echoing softly against the walls. At the bottom, the narrow hallway widened into a small room filled with the remnants of old equipment. A cracked console blinked weakly in one corner, and a makeshift cot sat against the far wall. Daniel gently placed Kara on the cot, her tiny frame barely making a dent in the fabric. She stirred slightly, her dark eyes fluttering open. For a moment, they locked onto his, filled with something between fear and trust. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. Kara didn't reply. Instead, she made a faint, melodic sound in her alien tongue. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him she was still fighting, still alive. Daniel rummaged through his pack, pulling out the last of his supplies: a small vial of water, a few scraps of food, and his trusty medkit. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He poured a few drops of water into her mouth, watching as her lips parted weakly to accept it. "Gotta keep you hydrated," he said. "I don't know how your biology works, but I figure water's universal, right?" Kara blinked at him, her expression unreadable. As Daniel worked, a faint beep echoed from the corner of the room. He stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The source was an old console he'd managed to jury-rig into a basic scanner. It wasn't reliable, but it was better than nothing. The blinking red light on the screen told him everything he needed to know. Someone, or something, was close. Daniel's stomach tightened. Krithan patrols rarely ventured this far into the wilderness, but they weren't the only threats out here. Scavengers like him often worked in packs, and not all of them were friendly. He stood, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The shelter had one way in and one way out, a design flaw he hadn't thought much about until now. If anyone found them, there'd be no escape. Kara made a soft sound, drawing his attention back to her. Her dark eyes were wide with alarm, her gaze fixed on the doorway. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the tension in the air. "Stay here," Daniel said, though he knew she didn't have a choice. He moved to the doorway, pressing his back against the cold metal wall. His sidearm felt heavy in his hand as he listened for any sign of movement. The faint beep of the console grew more insistent, a steady reminder of the danger closing in. Then he heard it, a soft scrape, like metal against stone. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. Daniel's pulse quickened. He'd dealt with scavengers before, but the idea of facing one while protecting Kara made his skin crawl. He couldn't leave her, but he couldn't let them find her either. The sound came again, closer this time. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying his aim. The darkness of the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the faint light from the room behind him casting long, eerie shadows. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the gloom. It was humanoid, but its movements were strange, almost jerky. For a moment, Daniel thought it might be a Krithan soldier, but as it stepped into the light, he realized it was something worse. A scavenger drone. The machine's single red eye scanned the room, its sharp claws clicking against the floor. Daniel held his breath, watching as the drone's sensors swept over him. It paused, its gaze lingering on the cot where Kara lay. Daniel acted on instinct, stepping into the open and firing a single precise shot. The drone's eye shattered, sparks flying as it crumpled to the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Then the console beeped again, a new signal, stronger this time. "Great," he muttered, turning back to Kara. "We've got company." Her eyes followed him as he grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder. "Looks like we're moving again, kid." Daniel scooped her up, ignoring the protest from his aching arms. The shelter had been a temporary haven, but it was no longer safe. The fight for survival wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As he climbed the stairs, the faint hum of more drones echoed in the distance. Daniel tightened his grip on Kara, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let her fall into their hands. Not now. Not ever. Unlikely allies. The forest was alive with sound. The distant chirping of alien insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the low hum of patrol drones sweeping the area. Daniel moved carefully, his steps muffled by the soft moss underfoot. Kara clung weakly to his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. The forest canopy above them cast fragmented shadows, hiding them from the sky's watchful eyes. He hadn't planned on heading this far into Krithan-controlled territory. But the patrols were relentless, and each pass drove him deeper into the alien wilderness. His makeshift map of the area, hastily drawn from scavenged intel, was useless here. He was officially lost. "Hang in there, kid," he whispered to Kara, more to calm himself than her. "We'll find a way out of this." The sudden snap of a branch stopped him in his tracks. Daniel froze, his grip tightening on Kara. The sound hadn't come from the underbrush. It was deliberate, calculated. Someone, or something, was nearby. Human. A guttural voice growled from behind him. "Don't move." Daniel turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. 4 Krithans emerged from the shadows, their pale blue skin blending seamlessly with the forest. They carried weapons, sleek, alien rifles that hummed faintly with power. Their eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on him with cold precision. Daniel's heart raced. He'd faced Krithan soldiers before, but these weren't the heavily armored warriors he'd seen on the battlefield. Their gear was mismatched, their uniforms tattered. Rebels, maybe. Outcasts. Either way, they didn't look friendly. The Krithan closest to him stepped forward, his weapon aimed squarely at Daniel's chest. "You carry one of ours," he said, his voice heavy with suspicion. "Why?" Daniel adjusted his grip on Kara, shielding her instinctively. "She was left behind," he said carefully. "I found her in the wreckage. She's hurt." The Krithan's eyes narrowed. "And you thought it wise to take her? To what end, human?" "To save her," Daniel shot back. "She's a kid. I wasn't going to leave her there to die." The Krithans exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a female with a jagged scar running down her cheek, stepped forward, her gaze shifting to Kara. Her lips parted in shock. "Kara," she whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to the others. "It's her, the general's daughter." Daniel's stomach sank. He didn't know much about Krithan politics, but he didn't need a translator to understand the implications. Kara wasn't just any child, she was important, which meant she was a bigger target than he'd realized. The leader of the group lowered his weapon slightly, his expression darkening. "You should not have interfered, human. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I kept her alive." "You're welcome." The Krithan growled, but the scared female raised a hand to stop him. "He may have saved her, Groth," she said. "And if the Empire finds her first, we lose everything." Groth hesitated, then glanced at Daniel. "You trust this human?" "No," the female said bluntly. "But Kara does." Daniel blinked. Kara, barely conscious, had reached out weakly toward the scared female, her small fingers grasping at the air. The Krithan softened, her scared face betraying a flicker of emotion. She turned back to Daniel. "You've complicated things, human," she said, "but if you truly want to help, you'll come with us. Quickly." Daniel's instincts screamed at him to refuse. He didn't trust them, and walking into their camp felt like volunteering for execution. But Kara stirred in his arms, letting out a weak, pained sound, and his resolve hardened. He didn't have another option. "Fine," he said. "Lead the way." The Krithans moved swiftly through the forest, their steps nearly silent despite their size. Daniel followed, keeping a firm grip on Kara and his sidearm. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a hidden encampment nestled in the roots of a massive bioluminescent tree. The glow from the tree cast an eerie light over the camp, illuminating clusters of tents and makeshift shelters. As they entered, Krithans stopped and stared. Whispers spread like wildfire, and Daniel felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He ignored them, focusing instead on the leader as he led them to a central tent. Inside, the air was thick with tension. A holographic map of the region flickered in the center, surrounded by crates of stolen supplies and alien weapons. The leader turned to Daniel, his expression grim. "If you're lying," Roth said, "I'll kill you myself." "I'm not," Daniel replied. "But if we're going to work together, you're going to have to trust me. At least a little." Kroth's glare softened slightly, but he didn't reply. Instead, he gestured for the scared female to tend to Kara. She stepped forward, her movements gentle as she examined the child. "She's weak," the female said, "but she'll survive, thanks to him." Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good. Now what?" Kroth crossed his arms. "Now we plan our next move. If the Empire tracks her here, they'll send everything they have. And if you want to live human, you'd better be ready to fight." Daniel glanced at Kara, her small chest rising and falling steadily. He didn't trust these Krythons, but for now, their goals aligned. "I'm in," he said, "but if you turn on me, this partnership ends fast." Kroth smirked. "Fair enough. Let's see if your actions match your words." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the coming battle pressing down on them all. Daniel tightened his grip on his sidearm, preparing for whatever lay ahead. He had no idea how this would end, but one thing was certain. Kara's survival depended on all of them now. Ambush at the crossing. The dense forest opened up to reveal a narrow valley, flanked by jagged cliffs that stretched high into the sky. At its center was the crossing, a crumbling bridge made of alien alloy, rusted and scarred from years of neglect. Beyond it lay the only path out of the Krython-controlled zone. Daniel stood at the tree line, scanning the area with a pair of battered binoculars. The bridge shimmered faintly under the pale light of Arion 4's twin moons, its surface reflecting the eerie blue glow of the alien wilderness. It looked deserted, but Daniel knew better. "Looks quiet," he said, lowering the binoculars. "Too quiet," Kroth replied, his tone grim. The Krython rebel leader stood beside him, his dark eyes fixed on the bridge. "The Empire doesn't leave a crossing like this unguarded." "Agreed," Daniel muttered. He shifted his grip on his rifle, glancing back at the group. The rest of the rebels were gathered around Kara, who rested on a makeshift stretcher. The scared female rebel, Lyra, knelt beside her, whispering softly in their alien language. Kara's presence was the only thing keeping the uneasy alliance intact. The Krython rebels needed her alive as much as Daniel did, though for different reasons. She was their symbol of hope, their rallying cry. But to the Empire, she was a threat, a prize to be hunted down at all costs. Daniel turned back to the bridge, his mind racing. They had to cross it, but every step forward felt like walking into a trap. "What's the plan?" he asked. Kroth's jaw tightened. "We move fast. If we're lucky, we'll be across before they react." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, because luck's been on our side so far." Kroth shot him a glare, but didn't reply. Instead, he signaled to the others, and the group began to move. Lyra carried Kara, her steps careful but quick. The rest of the rebels fanned out, their weapons at the ready. As they approached the bridge, Daniel's unease grew. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. He scanned the cliffs above, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. Then it happened. A sharp whine pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of a railgun charging. "Down!" Daniel shouted, throwing himself to the ground as a bolt of energy streaked past him. It hit the bridge with a deafening crack, sending shards of metal flying in every direction. Chaos erupted. Krython soldiers emerged from the cliffs, their sleek, black armor gleaming under the moonlight. Drones swooped down from above, their red sensors scanning the battlefield. "It's an ambush," Kroth roared, firing his weapon at the nearest drone. The rebels scrambled for cover, returning fire as the Empire's forces closed in. Daniel rolled onto his back, aiming at a drone that was diving toward Kara. He pulled the trigger, the shot hitting its mark, and sending the machine crashing to the ground. "We need to move," Lyra shouted, shielding Kara with her body. Daniel gritted his teeth, scanning the battlefield for an opening. The bridge was their only way out, but the enemy had them pinned down. "Croft," he called. "We need a distraction." Croft nodded, his face set with determination. He barked an order to the rebels, and 2 of them broke off, drawing the enemy's attention with a barrage of suppressing fire. "Now," Daniel shouted, grabbing Kara from Lara. He cradled her small body against his chest and sprinted toward the bridge, his heart pounding. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire and the metallic whir of drones. A bolt of energy sizzled past his ear, close enough to make his skin prickle. He didn't stop. The bridge groaned under their weight as they reached the halfway point. Behind them, the rebels were holding the line, but it was clear they couldn't hold out much longer. "Almost there," Daniel muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A loud explosion rocked the bridge, and Daniel stumbled, nearly losing his grip on Kara. He looked back to see a drone crashing into the structure, its self-destruct mechanism triggering a chain reaction. "Go!" Croft's voice rang out over the chaos. He was at the far end of the bridge, firing at the advancing soldiers. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, his legs burning with effort. The edge of the bridge loomed ahead, a tantalizing promise of safety. But as he reached it, a Krithan soldier appeared, blocking his path. The soldier raised his weapon, aiming directly at Daniel. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Daniel tightened his grip on Kara, his mind racing for a way out. Then, a shot rang out, and the soldier crumpled to the ground. Daniel looked up to see Lara standing behind him, her rifle smoking. She nodded, her expression fierce. "Keep going." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted off the bridge, collapsing onto the ground as the rebels caught up. The sound of the battle began to fade as the group retreated into the dense forest on the other side. Daniel looked down at Kara, who was still unconscious but alive. "You're not making this easy, kid," he muttered, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. Lara knelt beside him, her expression grim. "We bought ourselves time, but they'll be coming. We need to keep moving." Daniel nodded, forcing himself to his feet. The ambush had been close, too close, but they'd made it through. For now, that was enough. But as they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The final stand. The air was electric with tension as the small group emerged from the forest, stepping into the clearing that marked their final destination. The rendezvous point was eerily quiet, a stretch of barren land with an ancient broken communication tower rising in the center like a jagged monument to a forgotten age. Daniel scanned the horizon, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. The open field was a death trap, surrounded by rocky ridges that offered perfect vantage points for snipers or drones. He adjusted his grip on Kara, who was still weak but conscious, her wide, dark eyes peering up at him. "Why do I feel like we're walking into another trap?" Daniel muttered under his breath. "Because we probably are," Lara replied, her weapon raised and ready. The scared Krithan rebel was tense, her sharp gaze sweeping the cliffs. Croft was ahead of them, signaling the others to spread out and secure the area. Kara stirred in Daniel's arms, whispering something in her soft, melodic language. He couldn't understand the words, but the fear in her tone was unmistakable. "I know, kid," he said quietly. "I don't like it either." The group reached the base of the communication tower, and Croft immediately set to work. He pulled out a device that looked like a cross between a beacon and a transmitter, placing it on the ground and activating it with a sharp twist. The device hummed to life, emitting a low, pulsing sound. "It'll take a few minutes to send the signal," Croft said, his voice low. "We hold this position until the ship arrives." Daniel frowned. "And if the Empire shows up first, then we die fighting," Lara said bluntly. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Great, that's exactly what I wanted to hear." As if on cue, a distant roar shattered the stillness of the clearing. Daniel turned toward the sound, his stomach sinking as he spotted the dark, sleek shapes of enemy dropships descending from the clouds. "They're here," Lara hissed, raising her weapon. The clearing erupted into chaos. Crithan soldiers poured from the dropships, their black armor gleaming in the fading light. Drones buzzed overhead, their red sensors sweeping the battlefield. Daniel ducked behind a pile of rubble, cradling Kara, as energy bolts lit up the air around them. "This is bad," he muttered. Croft and the other rebels opened fire, their weapons unleashing a hail of energy blasts that lit up the night. The Empire's forces advanced steadily, their superior numbers threatening to overwhelm the small group. "We can't hold them off forever," Lyra shouted over the din. "We don't have to," Gruff barked back. "The ship is coming." Daniel peeked over the rubble, his heart pounding. The rebels were holding their ground, but it was clear they were outmatched. He had to do something, but with Kara in his arms, his options were limited. "Kid," he whispered, looking down at her, "you're going to be okay. I promise." Kara reached up, her small hand brushing against his face. Her touch was light, but there was a strange strength in it, as if she understood the gravity of the moment. Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the clearing, sending shockwaves through the ground. Daniel turned to see one of the dropships engulfed in flames, a bright streak of light cutting through the sky. "Look!" Lyra shouted, pointing upward. A massive ship was descending from the clouds, its sleek alien design unmistakable. The rebels let out a collective cheer as the ship's weapons lit up, firing on the Empire's forces with deadly precision. "They're here," Roth roared, a rare note of hope in his voice. The enemy forces began to retreat under the onslaught, their disciplined advance turning into a frantic scramble for cover. The dropships lifted off, disappearing into the night sky as the rebel ship landed in the clearing. The ramp lowered, and a group of Crithan soldiers emerged, their uniforms marked with the insignia of Kara's family. They moved with purpose, their eyes locking onto the child in Daniel's arms. One of them, a tall figure with an air of authority, stepped forward. He knelt before Kara, speaking in their melodic language. Kara's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to him, her voice trembling as she replied. Daniel stepped back, his arms suddenly feeling empty as the soldier gently took Kara from him. For a moment, he felt a pang of loss, but it was quickly replaced by relief. She was safe now. Liara approached him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "You did well, human," she said. "Better than I expected." Daniel smirked, exhaustion washing over him. "Don't get used to it." As the soldiers began to board the ship, one of them turned to Daniel and spoke in halting, accented English. "You come too. The general wishes to thank you personally." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Roth and Lyra. They both nodded, their expressions unreadable. "Guess I'm not done yet," he muttered, following them up the ramp. The ship's engines roared to life, lifting off into the night sky. Below them, the battlefield faded into darkness, leaving behind the scars of a conflict that had changed everything. For Daniel, the fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The price of humanity. The medbay was silent, save for the faint hum of the alien ship's engines. Daniel lay on a sterile slab, his body wrapped in an advanced healing cocoon that felt equal parts soothing and suffocating. The Crithans had patched him up with their technology, but he wasn't sure if the discomfort in his chest came from his injuries or from everything he had just lived through. "You're awake," a calm, melodic voice said. Daniel turned his head to see Kara standing beside him. Her injuries were gone, replaced by a faint glow of health. She wore a ceremonial robe that looked too grand for her small frame, and her dark eyes were steady, but there was a sadness in them that made Daniel's throat tighten. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice hoarse. "Looking better." Kara stepped closer, reaching out to touch his hand. Her small fingers were warm against his skin, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said something in her language, her tone soft and filled with gratitude. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. Before Daniel could respond, The doors to the medbay slid open with a sharp hiss. A tall Krithan entered, his presence commanding. His robes shimmered with intricate patterns, and his expression was a mix of gratitude and formality. This was Kara's father, the general. "You must be the human," the general said, his voice deep and resonant, his English surprisingly fluent. "Daniel Reed." Daniel sat up slowly, wincing as his body protested. "That's me," he said, "and you must be the guy everyone's fighting over." The general's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I am General Virak, leader of the Krithan resistance. More importantly, I am Kara's father." He looked down at his daughter, his expression softening. "You saved her when you had no reason to. For that, I owe you a debt I cannot repay." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly uncomfortable. "It wasn't a big deal," he said. "She's just a kid. Someone had to do something." Virak's gaze sharpened. "You risk your life for her. For us. That is not something we take lightly." He gestured to the doorway, where Lyra and Kroth were waiting. "You have also gained the respect of my people. That is no small feat." Daniel snorted. "Well, if I knew getting shot at was all it took, I'd have signed up for this mess a lot sooner." Lyra rolled her eyes but smirked. Kroth just crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. The general stepped closer, his tone growing serious. "I have summoned you here because the fight is not over. The Empire will come for us again, and they will not stop until we are crushed. But your actions have given us a chance to fight back." Daniel frowned. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Virak said, "that we need allies. And you, Daniel Reed, have proven that humanity is capable of something the Empire is not: compassion." Daniel blinked, taken aback. "Compassion? You're giving me way too much credit." Virak shook his head. "You saved Kara without expecting anything in return. You risked everything for her, even when it was not your fight. That is compassion, and it is something we need if we are to survive." Kara tugged at her father's robe, speaking quickly in their language. Virak listened, his expression softening again. He nodded, then turned back to Daniel. "My daughter believes you should be part of this fight," he said, "not as an outsider, but as one of us. She trusts you, and so do I." Daniel let out a shaky laugh. "You want me to join your rebellion? I'm just a scavenger. I don't even know how half your tech works." "You have already proven yourself," Lyra said, stepping into the room. "You think we care about your tech skills? You have courage, and you think on your feet. That's more than enough." Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life on the fringes, scraping by on the ruins of other people's wars. He had never been a soldier, never fought for something bigger than himself. But now, looking at Kara and the rebels around him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. "What's the plan?" he asked finally, his voice steady. Virak's lips curved into a small, approving smile. "The plan is to give the Empire a reason to fear us." Lyra smirked. "And to teach you how to fight like a Krithan." Daniel grinned despite himself. "Sounds like a terrible idea." "I'm in." Kara beamed, her small hand gripping his tightly. For the first time since he had stepped onto the battlefield, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the ship soared through the stars, leaving the war-torn planet behind, Daniel couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The fight ahead would be brutal, and the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time, he wasn't running away. He was ready to stand and fight. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone.